The system influencing your behavior right now and the tradition that perfected witchcraft 1,000 years ago were built on the same operating logic. Nobody told you that. There's a reason. What if the hidden power operating invisible structures never needed to be invisible? Most people assume that influence, to be effective, must be concealed, that the machinery of control operates somewhere behind the scenes, in places deliberately kept out of reach. That assumption is not an accident. It is the first layer of the design. The most sophisticated influence systems ever built work entirely in the open. They rely on a single, elegant principle, that familiarity functions as camouflage. When you encounter something often enough, your brain reclassifies it from stimulus to background. And background is where the deepest behavioral conditioning happens, precisely because it stops triggering scrutiny. Think about the symbols you encounter before you've finished your first sentence of the day. The icons on your phone screen, the logo on your coffee cup, the visual grammar of every app interface designed to feel intuitive. None of that is intuitive. All of it was constructed with the specific understanding of how the human perceptual system processes shapes, colors, and spatial relationships below the threshold of conscious decision-making. This is applied occult knowledge in modern life, stripped of its ceremonial language and rebuilt in the vocabulary of UX design and behavioral economics. The mechanism is identical. The intention is identical. The academic credentials of the people deploying it are different. Here's what makes this more than an interesting observation. The Western esoteric traditions that systematized symbolic influence beginning in the Renaissance were not primarily concerned with supernatural effects. The serious practitioners, the ones whose work has been rigorously studied by historians of religion and cognitive anthropologists, were concerned with one thing: producing reliable, repeatable changes in human perception and behavior through structured symbolic input. They called it ceremonial magic. They documented the methodology with the rigor of engineers. That documentation did not disappear. It migrated into psychology, into advertising, into the architecture of platforms that billions of people use daily without once asking who designed the symbols and what those symbols were designed to produce. Ancient symbols with measurable influence on behavior are not relics. They are infrastructure, renamed, redeployed, and more effective now than at any point in recorded history because the scale of delivery has never been this large. And almost no one is examining the origin of the architecture. If this kind of investigation speaks to you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. How forbidden knowledge and its real-world consequences survive by becoming unrecognizable. There is a pattern that runs through the history of esoteric knowledge with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss once you start tracing it. Every time a system of symbolic influence became politically threatening, it did not get destroyed. It got absorbed, renamed, relocated inside institutions that the existing power structure considered legitimate, and therefore left alone. The alchemists became chemists and depth psychologists. The astrologers became astronomers and personality researchers. The practitioners of ceremonial magic became behavioral scientists, hypnotherapists, and, in at least several documented cases, the early architects of modern advertising theory. That is not a conspiracy. It is how knowledge actually moves through history when the people who hold it understand that the symbol outlives the system that condemned it. What gets lost in that migration is the intentionality. The original traditions were explicit about what they were doing and why. They named the mechanism. They documented the relationship between symbolic input, emotional state, activation, and behavioral output with the directness that the disciplines that absorbed them deliberately chose to obscure. The reason for that obscuration is not complicated. Knowledge that explains how behavior is shaped through symbolic means is significantly more powerful in the hands of someone who controls the symbols than in the hands of someone who understands what the symbols are doing to them. This is the real-world consequence of forbidden knowledge that most modern treatments of the subject completely miss. The forbidden part was never the information itself. The forbidden part was the understanding of mechanism, the map of how it works, because the map is what creates the possibility of not being moved by it without your awareness. Here's what that means practically. Every major behavioral influence system operating at scale today, social media feed algorithms, political messaging architecture, product design for habitual use, employs a sequence that the ceremonial magic traditions mapped with precision centuries before the technology existed to deploy it at this scale. Symbolic input, emotional state activation, behavioral reinforcement, repetition until the pattern is stable. The tradition called that sequence a working. The industry calls it engagement optimization. Drop a comment if this connection has ever crossed your mind. You might be further along in this investigation than you think. Why? Invisible symbolic control over human decisions is the oldest technology nobody calls technology. In 1947, Norbert Wiener published the foundational theory of cybernetics, the study of feedback loops in complex systems. His work became the conceptual backbone of modern computing, artificial intelligence, and the behavioral architecture of every digital platform currently in operation. What almost no biography of Wiener mentions is that he was in active correspondence with figures in the mid-century occult revival who were developing what they called chaos magic, a stripped-down, psychologically grounded reformulation of Western ceremonial practice. The overlap was not coincidental. Both projects were solving the same problem. How do you reliably modify a complex system's behavior by introducing carefully selected inputs at precisely calibrated moments, then measuring the response and refining the input until the desired state is stable? Wiener called it feedback-controlled behavior modification. The occultists called it practical magic. The structural description is the same. This is where the pattern breaks open in a way that is hard to unsee once you have looked at it directly. Ancient magic reframed through modern psychology is not a metaphor or a loose analogy. It is a historical and structural convergence documented by researchers working in the history of science, the anthropology of religion, and the cognitive science of ritual. The people who built the behavioral architecture of the internet were, in several traceable cases, either directly influenced by mid-century occult theory or working from the same foundational sources that the mid-century occultists were drawing from. The lineage is real, the influence is real, and it is operating right now in every recommendation system that has ever suggested a video, a product, or a political position to you based on a behavioral profile built from years of observed pattern. How belief systems shape perception without awareness is not an abstract philosophical question. It is the operational description of what happens every time an algorithm selects a symbolic input specifically because your past behavior indicates it will activate a state that produces a predictable response. The magician knew exactly what the ritual was doing to the participant. The platform knows exactly what the feed is doing to the user. The participant didn't know. The user doesn't know. That asymmetry of awareness is where all the leverage lives. If this is shifting something for you, the like button tells the algorithm this conversation matters. It keeps this kind of content alive. What if arcane secrets decoded through pattern recognition were never actually hidden? There is a particular kind of document that keeps appearing in the archives of Western esoteric history. Not grimoires, not ritual manuals, something more unsettling. Practical guides, written with the tone of engineering specifications, describing how to construct symbolic environments that produce specific internal states in the people who inhabit them. The medieval cathedral was one of these environments. Every architectural choice, the geometry of the nave, the angle of light through stained glass, the acoustic design that made the human voice resonate in specific frequencies, was selected with an explicit intention to produce an internal state of osmosis and receptivity in the congregation before a single word of doctrine was spoken. This was not incidental. It was the primary technology. The theology came second. The symbolic environment created the state. The state created the receptivity. The receptivity made the theology land in a way it never could have if delivered in a neutral room to a person in an ordinary state of mind. Now consider what the most sophisticated product design teams in Silicon Valley have spent the last 2 decades building. Every major platform interface is an environment engineered to produce a specific sequence of internal states: curiosity, activation, anticipation, variable reward, social comparison, status, anxiety, relief through engagement. Each transition in the sequence is calculated. Each symbol, color choice, notification sound, and spatial arrangement in the interface was selected because behavioral testing confirmed it produced the desired state transition in the majority of users. That is the hidden meaning in everyday symbols and rituals that almost no one in the conversation about technology is willing to name directly. The architects of these systems know exactly what they are building. Several of them have said so in internal communications that became public. The language they use in those private contexts is remarkably close to the language of applied influence traditions that most of their public-facing communications treat as irrelevant mythology. The convergence is not metaphorical. It is operational. What you are inside when you open any major application is not a neutral tool. It is a designed symbolic environment with a specific intention about what state you should be in and what behavior that state should produce. The cathedral and the feed are the same architecture. One was built for a different kind of institution. Both were built with the same understanding of what symbols do to human beings before they decide how to respond. How conscious witchcraft as a system of symbolic power answers the question everyone is asking without knowing it. There is a question embedded in every serious investigation of hidden power and symbolic influence that most investigators stop just short of asking directly. Not because the answer is supernatural, because the answer is uncomfortably practical. If these systems know exactly what symbolic inputs produce which internal states, in which kinds of people, under which conditions, and if that knowledge has been deployed at scale for the explicit purpose of producing behavioral outcomes in populations that have no awareness of the mechanism, then what does an individual actually do with that understanding? The contemporary witchcraft revival in the United States is, at its most serious and least sensationalized level, one answer to that question. Strip away the aesthetic, and what remains is a rigorous, historically grounded practice of developing conscious agency over your own internal states through structured symbolic work, not to produce external supernatural effects, to develop the capacity to notice when your state is being formed from outside, to interrupt the automatic response sequence, and to choose a response that actually reflects your own intention rather than the intention of whoever designed the input. That is, the occult awareness applied to professional and personal decisions that the serious practitioners of these traditions have been describing for centuries in language that contemporary audiences kept misreading as supernatural claim rather than psychological methodology. Here is what almost no one in either the technology criticism space or the contemporary occult revival space is saying clearly enough. The asymmetry between the people who understand how symbolic influence works and the people who are subject to it without that understanding is not primarily a political problem or a spiritual problem. It is an attention problem. The capacity to notice, in real time, that a symbol has activated a state in you before you consciously registered the input is a trainable skill. It has been trained deliberately in various traditions across cultures for as long as documented human history reaches. The hidden power in visible structures does not become less powerful when you recognize it, but recognition changes your relationship to the response it produces in you. And that change is the entire difference between being moved and choosing to move. The esoteric traditions that preserved this understanding across centuries of institutional hostility were not protecting supernatural secrets. They were protecting something far more valuable and far more threatening than any system that depends on unconscious compliance. They were protecting the map of the mechanism. You are holding part of that map right now. If this opens something in you, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the bell so you don't miss the next investigation. And tell me in the comments, what part of this are you still thinking about?